zero trust model. Here is what it is not. The zero trust model is not a product, it's not a protocol, it's not a VPN or a device such as a firewall or server or any other device that could actually think of out there. Now, if you've been studying for any cybersecurity related certifications such as Security Plus or CISR or whatever certification it is, you'd realize that the ZTM or zero trust model is often referenced, meaning it is important for us to understand how it works. And organizations would endeavor to make sure that everything that they do in the environment makes that environment more secure. Let's take, for example, that we have Sarah over here, and Sarah has access to multiple resources in our organization, and we want to just make sure that Sarah accesses those resources securely. So we could have various authentication methods and maybe include, not even maybe, actually include multi-factor authentication as a way of fortifying our security. We could have firewalls in there, we could have some identity and access management solution, and various other ways in which you could protect how this identity or user over here accesses those resources. And now, for us to be more stronger as an environment, we would then think of adding zero trust model. However, this is sometimes confused with how VPNs actually play a role within the environment. Now, I'm going to illustrate as we go on how those two would actually function. If we have, for example, a VPN within our environment, what you're trying to do is to give a solution that assumes that an identity or a user, such as Sarah, is actually working within our organization. So we're giving them a door, so to say, that gives them access to the entire resources or sector of resources that we have. Could be servers, could be applications, whatever it is that actually exists beyond that door. And every time this identity or user accesses any resource over here based on their IP address, the network would simply assume that that particular user is secure because they have an IP address that is within the range of IP addresses contained in here. Now, that's one access door to various resources that are contained within that environment. Of course, there'll be also additional authentication methods to those servers, etc. Now, if we want to have a zero trust model within our environment, we are simply saying, look, we are going to create a door for each and every resource that we have within our environment. So there would be a door that gives us access to particular servers, a door that gives us access to an application, a door that gives us access to maybe a cloud-based whatever it is, whether it's an application or a firewall, whatever it is. So what we're simply doing is that we are granularizing, we're simply breaking down the way in which Sarah accesses those resources over there in such a way that if Sarah is accessing this server over here, let's call it server A, she would only have access to that server, and she has to ensure that her access to that server is authenticated by an agent. In this case, we would have a zero trust model agent such as Zscaler, which would actually make sure that the IP address or IP range which is on that device, as well as what is permissible based on the rules that are set for Sarah to have access to that server, is actually aligning. Now, many organizations would have various resources in the cloud. So you would have your servers in the cloud, you would have your firewall, you would have your virtual machines, etc., and applications. And what we're trying to do in this case is that for each and every time that somebody tries to access a resource, they should be authenticated based on that particular resource. You're trying to access an application, you should be given access to that application instead of you having access to a segment that allows you to have access to multiple applications. So we're giving you access based on that application, and you have constant monitoring that has to happen to make sure that you are truly doing so in a secure way and you are the identity that actually makes that work. Now, zero trust model would not work independently. It has to work alongside an identity and access management solution. And there are various tools over here such as Okta. You could be using that for identity, or maybe Microsoft authentication, which is very common. So if you're using Microsoft authentication, that is what would authenticate that you are truly the user that belongs to, let's say, organization XYZ over here. And once we've authenticated you over there, then we also have to make sure that the agent that is installed over here has authenticated you. So there's double authentication over there. And after that authentication, you are now having access to the rightful application or the rightful server. Now, for zero trust model to be very effective, it actually hinges on two fundamental principles. One of them is what is known as the control plane. So the control plane is important in the sense that it actually focuses on your networks, it focuses on the IP addresses, it focuses on everything that is happening in terms of the functional movement of information and various types of infrastructure that is being accessed throughout the session that you're connecting that resource. And this is more of the engine, you may say, that actually runs your ZTM. And then you also have what is known as the data plane. Data plane is also very important. Now, what the data plane actually does is that it focuses on the data. All right. It focuses on what you're trying to access, what you're trying to do, how are you accessing that, and how is your interaction with the various tasks that you're trying to perform. So let's say Sarah over here has access to, let's say, some business intelligence software. And in the process, Sarah has access to personal identifiable information. And we have a policy which would fall under this. So with policies under data plane, we have a policy over here that enforces that data that is regarded as PII should never be shared. Okay, so each and every time Sarah accesses PII data, the data plane would be keeping an eye on that. And in the event that this information happens to be treated or interacted with in a way that breaches that policy, there would actually be a trigger that informs us that this identity is trying to perform an action that is not permissible. And thereby, that particular activity would be blocked from that application. Now, in the event that Sarah turns rogue and happens to be somebody who is actually trying to perform an unauthorized activity within our environment, the degree of damage that is going to happen to that particular attempt would only be isolated to the application that Sarah is trying to actually work with. It won't affect our server. It won't affect other applications that Sarah has no access to, which actually helps us in such a way that if we have users who are accessing resources from various locations, we now have a way in which they could securely access resources outside our usual perimeter. Now, IP addresses would give you a perimeter in which you are able to function in, like in the case of making use of a VPN. But then what actually happens with zero trust model is that you are going beyond that by providing access based on the resource, a server, an application, a virtual machine, etc. And that, my friend, is actually what makes ZTM or zero trust model to be unique. All right, to close it off, here's a quick takeaway on zero trust model. Zero trust model was built on the mantra that we should never trust any connection, any identity, or anything that purports to have connected before must never be trusted. However, we should always verify. So for any connection that is happening that actually might be appearing in our logs or has an IP that is familiar, there must always be verification. And this helps us in making sure that our environment remains strong as ever. Let me know in the comment section what you think is the best definition for zero trust model.